When Eliza Monroe discovered a sealed wax paper bundle hidden behind a crumbling wall in her long-abandoned orchard house, she never imagined it would unravel the secret chapters of a life she had long resigned to sorrow. Decades after Corporal William Hart vanished into the chaos of war, with only a promise whispered beneath blooming magnolias, a yellowed letter bearing his unmistakable hand revealed an astonishing truth. He hadn't perished in the Ardennes, but had been drawn into a covert world where his disappearance was meant to protect her. The revelation of a hidden legacy, a son born of an unknown past, and the clandestine operations that had kept him away shattered the silence of her lifelong vigil. Stay until the end. What would you do if the man you loved most vanished to shield you, only to return years later with secrets that rewove the fabric of your heart? When Eliza Monroe first slipped her arms around William Hart under a canopy of blooming magnolias, she never imagined the turn their love story would take. By 1944, she was 19, filled with a gentle confidence born of orchard breezes and small-town warmth. He was 23, kind-eyed, steady-handed, and impossibly brave. They danced at sunset in her family's Virginia orchard, their bare feet imprinting the soft, fragrant grass. When it grew dark, they found themselves under a string of lanterns lit by friends and family, and the orchard seemed to glow with promises of a future as sweet as the fruit on the branches. They were married that spring in a modest ceremony behind the farmhouse, the sky clear and the magnolias shedding pale petals around them. William kissed her palm before he boarded the train to basic training. Her parents stood by stoically, proud and anxious, while Eliza tried to hold back her tears. He pressed one final letter into her hand, telling her to open it only once he was gone. The letter read, in his looping script, that no matter what the war demanded, he would return to her. He asked her to wait. Victory in Europe came almost a year later, bringing parades and cheers in every corner of the nation. Yet William never returned. No matter how many trains arrived in her small town, no matter how many uniforms she scanned in the street, his face remained missing. The army sent only one telegram: missing in action. Last seen, the Ardennes. No body, no belongings, no answers. Her friends murmured that war did that to men, swallowed them whole. Eliza believed otherwise. She felt him still, as if he might be only a step behind her, waiting for the right moment to appear. She kept a candle in her bedroom window, night after night, a silent vigil for the man whose last promise was that he would come home. Every December, on his birthday, she wrote to the War Office. She asked if there was any progress, any clue, any chance. They always replied with the same sterile regret. Meanwhile, life around her moved on. Friends married, had children, built futures. She remained Eliza Monroe, the orchard caretaker's daughter, the widow who wasn't officially a widow. Then, in 1957, after her parents passed away, she relented to the practicalities of the world and remarried quietly. Her second husband was a kind man who understood there was a part of her heart still bound to William. She kept William's picture in a music box by her bed, locked away like a private vow that remained unbroken. Years folded into decades. The orchard went untended after the rest of her family left. Her second marriage ended amicably with no children. By 2023, Eliza was 99 years old, living in a small cottage near the orchard, her bones frail but her mind sharp. Her grandson by marriage, Aaron Monroe, an energetic man in his 30s, decided to restore the old orchard house that once belonged to Eliza's family, a place of memories and dust. He wanted to see if anything was salvageable. Each day, while Eliza rocked on the porch, he pried away rotted panels, hammered out old nails, and discovered corners of the house that had been hidden for a century. On a mild April morning, as sunlight filtered through the budding trees, Aaron was removing a section of wall in an upstairs room when something tumbled out from behind the plaster. It was a wax paper bundle, sealed carefully, stamped with faint army markings that had nearly faded from time. Intrigued, he carried it to Eliza, who sat in the shade, her cane resting by her chair. She opened the bundle with trembling hands. Inside, she discovered a single yellowed envelope. The address, written in an unmistakable hand, read, Mrs. Eliza Hart, private. Only if necessary. She felt her heart lurch at that name. Heart, the name she had not worn in decades. She stared at Aaron, tears welling up before she'd even slit the envelope. When she finally opened it, her entire body seemed to quiver with anticipation. The letter was dated April 1952. The handwriting was William's. My dearest Eliza, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I never died in the Ardennes. I was recruited for an intelligence operation. The army needed men who could vanish, and I could. Fluent in German, no children, no ties that drew public scrutiny. I agreed, but only under one condition, that you would be protected. That meant I could never contact you. They told me I'd be gone 6 months. It's been years now. I'm tired. But there's one truth you deserve. I never stopped loving you. Find Agent Ash. He can explain the rest. Eliza clutched the paper, tears streaming down her cheeks. For so long, she had believed in her heart that William had never simply abandoned her. Now she had proof. He was alive long after the army said he was missing. He'd been caught in a world of secrets, forced to disappear. She thanked Aaron for finding the letter, and he hugged his grandmother with trembling hands, unsure of what to say. That evening, Eliza couldn't sleep. She sat up in her armchair, the letter in her lap, reading it over and over. She whispered William's name to the still air. Even at 99, she felt the same rush she'd known decades before, when his arms had enclosed her beneath the magnolia blossoms. There had to be more to this story. If William had worked for intelligence, perhaps there were records, somewhere. She needed to try. With Aaron's help, Eliza reached out to a Cold War historian in Washington, D.C. They scanned the letter, highlighting keywords. Agent Ash, 1952, intelligence operation. Within days, the historian uncovered old documents referencing a U.S. operative named Ash, believed to have been embedded in East Berlin from 1947 to 1952. The code name was decommissioned in mid-1952, with no official debrief or discharge. No death certificate, just a blank spot in the files. It was as if he had vanished from the records the moment his work ended. Buried in one declassified memo from 1954 was a line that made Eliza's breath catch. Ash exfiltrated 5 civilians. Final extraction included minor, origin disputed. Believed to be of personal importance. Aaron read it aloud, glancing at Eliza with confusion. A child? He asked. The historian on the phone agreed it seemed so. The question burned on Eliza's lips. If William was Agent Ash, was the child his own? They tracked a partial adoption record in a Berlin humanitarian archive. It referenced an N. Hart, born 1951, orphaned in Hamburg, father unknown. The file listed a single American contact, Agent Ash. The next line stated that the child had been adopted in 1956 by a Dutch couple, receiving the name Nicolai Jansen. At present, he would be around 72, living somewhere in Utrecht, the Netherlands. Eliza's heart pounded. She had always been certain if William had fathered a child, she would have known. Unless, of course, the child's mother was someone else, someone in Europe. She fought back a swirl of jealousy, curiosity, and sorrow. But deeper than all those emotions was a blossoming sense of hope. Perhaps this child carried a piece of William's love, his legacy. Aaron wrote a polite letter to Nicolai Jansen. They waited 3 long weeks. Each day, Eliza sat by the window, as she once had, expecting William to walk up the orchard path. Instead, she found herself reliving that quiet ache of anticipation. Finally, a response arrived. Nicolai wrote that he had always suspected his origins were unusual. He remembered being lifted by a strong man out of a dark tunnel when he was very young, though the memory was hazy. He was intrigued to hear of William Hart and the clues linking them. He invited Eliza to visit. Even though age weighed on her, Eliza refused to let Aaron make the journey alone. She insisted she must go and see this man who might be William's child. So they made arrangements, booking careful flights and scheduling wheelchair assistance. Despite her frail body, Eliza felt a quiet determination, a sense that she was finally answering the question that had haunted her for decades. They arrived in Utrecht one mild day, a light mist covering the cobblestone streets. The canal waters reflected old stone bridges. Aaron pushed Eliza's wheelchair through the city, their breath catching in the crisp air. They reached a small cafe whose windows glowed warmly against the mist. Inside, Nikolai waited, a tall man with silver hair at his temples and a hesitant smile. He stood up as soon as they entered, and Aaron helped Eliza stand. She leaned on her cane and took several steps forward until she was close enough to see the resemblance clearly. The shape of his jaw, the kind eyes. He looked startlingly like William. They exchanged no words at first. Nikolai's eyes welled with emotion. Eliza reached out, her hand trembling, and he gently clasped her fingers. He whispered, "I think I've been waiting for you my entire life, without knowing why." That simple statement made tears course down Eliza's cheeks. She managed to nod, her voice catching as she spoke. "Your father was the bravest man I knew. He promised he'd come back. I suppose, in a way, he did through you." They sat for hours, sipping tea and trading stories. Nikolai recalled scraps of memory from East Berlin. The hushed tension of men speaking low in German, the sense of being rushed through alleyways at night, the strong arms that carried him more than once. "I remember a face in the shadows," he said softly. "He would check on me, stroke my hair, and say something like, 'You'll be safe soon, son.' My adoptive parents said an American soldier gave me to them. They never knew his name. They died when I was in my 30s, so I couldn't ask them more." Aaron listened, spellbound, while Eliza dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. She could envision William in those bleak post-war streets, forging false papers, risking his life to rescue a child who had nowhere else to go. Had love for that child grown alongside his longing for Eliza? Nikolai opened his wallet and pulled out a weathered photo. In it, a man stood in partial silhouette holding a small boy. Even though the picture was grainy, Eliza knew it was William from the curve of his shoulders, the tilt of his head. She lightly traced the photograph's edge, her breath catching. "He's older there than when I last saw him," she said. "But it's him." As they lingered in the cafe, Nikolai reached into a small velvet pouch. From it, he removed a simple gold wedding band. He placed it carefully in Eliza's palm. She saw the inscription, "Forever." Her lips parted in disbelief. She recognized it as the ring she had placed on William's finger on their wedding day. Only she had assumed it was lost on the battlefield. Nikolai explained that his adoptive mother had passed it down to him with no explanation beyond. "A brave American soldier wanted you to have this. He said it belonged to his wife, that you might need it someday." Eliza closed her eyes and let out a quiet sob. The weight of decades pressed on her heart, but it was paired with a new kind of relief. William had not only survived, he had managed to keep that ring, his love for her literally in hand, all while fighting to rescue a child. For the first time in her long life, Eliza felt the final pieces of William's story falling into place. They lingered in Utrecht longer than planned. Aaron helped arrange a comfortable suite for Eliza near Nikolai's home. Each morning, they strolled along the canals, and in the evenings they'd gather in Nikolai's living room, combing through old records, trying to find out whether William might have left any further clues about his fate. Official documents ended abruptly after 1952, providing no final statement on whether he'd lived on under a new identity or perished in some clandestine assignment. That uncertainty weighed on Eliza. She admitted to Nikolai that she'd once believed she had to know every detail, or she'd never find peace. But now, seeing the ring and the photograph, she realized perhaps the greatest secret was not how or when William died, but the depth of his love that had survived any distance and any war. A few days later, Nikolai uncovered a surprising lead. One of his neighbors, an elderly woman named Marta, had come by to see Eliza, explaining that her late father had worked with Allied intelligence after the war. Marta's father once told her stories of an American known only as Hart, who smuggled refugees across the East German border. He spoke of him as a hero with a gentle spirit, especially protective of children. Marta never saw the man herself, but she recalled her father saying that Hart eventually fled to Switzerland to avoid being hunted by Soviet operatives. Marta rummaged through some old boxes and produced a slip of paper, a partial address in Geneva. It was dated 1954. The spark in Eliza's eyes returned. She and Aaron debated what to do. She was old, 99, and the journey to Geneva would be grueling. But Aaron insisted they should try, that she deserved to see if William might have left a final trace there. Nikolai, too, expressed a readiness to join. They agreed to travel by train, giving Eliza time to rest along the route. Switzerland greeted them with crisp mountain air and majestic vistas. Eliza felt oddly invigorated, as though each mile brought her closer to a man she could still picture in uniform, smiling at her under the magnolia blooms. They arrived at the partial address, which turned out to be an abandoned apartment building near the heart of Geneva. A caretaker was out front, sweeping the entrance, and looked curious when they asked about an American occupant from the 1950s. He invited them to look at some old tenant ledgers. There, in faded ink, was a single name scrawled in the column for 1954. W. Hart. The caretaker explained that the man apparently stayed for a year, maybe less, paying cash. No forwarding address was recorded, but the caretaker found a note in the margin. Left in hurry. Mentioned mountains. Retreat. It wasn't much to go on. Eliza sighed heavily, but refused to give in to disappointment. Together, they explored the building's hallways. At one point, they noticed a small courtyard at the center. A single magnolia tree stood there, incongruous in the alpine surroundings. Its blossoms were just beginning to open. Eliza inhaled sharply. How many times had she stood under magnolia branches, thinking of William? She shuffled over, leaning on her cane, running her hand along the trunk. Was it possible he had chosen this place to remind him of home? They left that day with no new leads, only the faint comfort of footprints left behind so long ago. Over dinner, the three of them, Eliza, Aaron, and Nikolai, talked about returning home. Then, almost as an afterthought, Nikolai mentioned a rumor that certain ex-operatives found refuge in smaller Swiss villages, where they could live undetected. Aaron brightened, remembering that someone in the orchard's local history group once mentioned a William H., who wrote letters to an international relief organization in the 1960s, describing safe routes for refugees. They pieced clues together and decided on a final push, traveling deeper into the countryside. It was a simple quest, perhaps foolish in the eyes of logic, searching for any trace of a man who might have died decades ago. Yet Eliza felt compelled to follow the last thread of hope. Each day, she woke feeling both anxious and exhilarated. On their second day in the Swiss countryside, they came upon a modest hospice run by a handful of nuns, perched on a hillside overlooking a small lake. Something about the place tugged at Eliza, though she couldn't say why. They went in, politely inquiring if an older American man had ever stayed there. The nun at the desk frowned, flipping through worn registry books. Her eyes lit up when she reached a page from the early 1970s. She spoke in soft English, pointing to a name, William H. He'd arrived with injuries from a fall in the mountains, receiving care for several months, then left, leaving no contact details. Eliza's heart raced at the confirmation that William had been alive well beyond 1952. They continued searching the Swiss countryside, always coming up short after each lead. But on their very last day, when travel plans demanded they return home, the caretaker of the hospice found a single envelope among old records, labeled for W.H., in case he ever returned. Inside was a note in William's handwriting, presumably never mailed. If I don't make it back, let it be known that I died in gratitude, remembering my wife, Eliza Monroe, who waited for me under magnolia blossoms. I hope someday she can forgive me for not returning sooner. I hope she knows I never forgot her love, or the orchard that once sheltered us. Eliza's vision blurred with tears. She read the note again and again, feeling William's presence in every word. Yet it wasn't proof of his death. The caretaker said that once he left, they never heard of him again. They returned to Utrecht with heavy hearts, yet a certain peace had begun to grow in Eliza. If William had survived the war and carried her memory through all those years, perhaps that was enough. She found solace in Nikolai's presence. Through him, she saw William's eyes, William's determination. She told him stories of the orchard, how the magnolias bloomed in the spring, how William danced barefoot with her on their wedding day. In return, Nikolai told her of his own life, an engineer who had lived many places, always drawn to helping others. They realized how William's spirit thrived in both of them. Eliza's unwavering devotion, Nikolai's quiet drive to protect those in need. Aaron watched them from the sidelines, amazed at how hope could blossom in the twilight of his grandmother's life. He suggested that maybe they should all return to Virginia, to the orchard, and see if the old house might be turned into a place where the family could gather again. Eliza and Nikolai agreed, feeling the pull of that land, where William's story had truly begun. A few weeks later, they stood on the orchard soil in Virginia, the magnolia trees bursting with fresh blooms. The old farmhouse had partially collapsed, but Aaron had cleared away debris and set about a new round of renovations. Eliza and Nikolai walked the grounds, breathing in the sweet spring air. She showed him the exact spot where she and William had been wed, the lanterns strung up overhead, the guests cheering when William spun her in a circle. In that moment, standing on the orchard grass, Eliza felt a rush of warmth in her chest. She closed her eyes and heard the echo of piano music from decades ago, the gentle notes William used to play on a rainy afternoon. She opened her eyes to see Nikolai offering a small wooden music box, Eliza's own, the one she'd kept for so many years. He'd repaired it, and when she lifted the lid, the tune tinkled out, the same melody William had once played. She laughed through tears, feeling the orchard fill with echoes of a love she had never truly lost. Standing together, they heard a sound behind them. At first, it seemed like a trick of the breeze, but then the figure of a man emerged from behind the corner of the farmhouse. He moved carefully, leaning on a walking stick, his posture stooped with age. Eliza froze, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely breathe. Aaron rushed forward, but then halted, stunned by the sight of the man's face. He looked ancient, his hair white, his skin lined by decades of sun and hardship. But as Eliza's gaze landed on the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the faint tilt of his mouth, an impossible truth took shape. It was William Hart. The old man's eyes flicked across the orchard. He seemed almost afraid to step forward, as though this dream might vanish. Then he murmured, in a voice trembling with time, "Eliza!" She let out a strangled cry of joy and disbelief, dropping her cane as Nikolai helped her stand upright. She reached for William, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of his coat. Felt real. He was real. His hand came up to cradle her cheek. The orchard fell silent, as if the wind itself held its breath. "I spent so many years trying to come back," William whispered, his voice cracking. "When I thought it was too late, I stayed away, afraid of what you'd think of me, afraid you'd moved on. But I had to see this orchard one last time." She pressed her forehead against his, tears slipping down her wrinkled cheeks. "I never stopped waiting," she managed, voice quivering. "I thought you died, but in my heart, I prayed for this moment. And now you're here." William's eyes shifted to Nikolai, who stood a few paces back, tears running freely. The old soldier took in the sight, the uncanny resemblance, and realized who this man had to be. Nikolai stepped closer, unsure whether to speak. Then William pulled him into a gentle, trembling embrace. "I'm sorry," William said, voice low and shaky. "I tried to keep you safe, to give you a life far from the war and the danger that followed me. I never imagined you would find me." Aaron watched in awe as the three stood in the orchard, the magnolia petals floating down around them like soft confetti. For a moment, time folded onto itself, and the sadness of the past was eclipsed by this improbable reunion. Eliza hardly dared to blink, worried she might wake up to find it all a dream, but William's hand stayed clasped around hers, a tangible reminder that sometimes miracles did happen. They spent the next days in a state of wonder, listening as William recounted a harrowing life lived in the shadows, helping refugees cross borders, living under false names, and finally hiding away in remote corners of Europe, convinced that returning to Eliza would endanger her. Decades turned into a lifetime. He'd heard rumors of her possible remarriage and thought she deserved peace without him. Yet he could never quite leave behind the orchard in his memories, or the woman who waited there. Now, at last, they had both come home. The orchard, in its renewal, seemed to welcome them with open arms. White blossoms swayed in the breeze, the farmhouse walls echoing with family voices. Aaron, with tears in his eyes, promised to rebuild the house stronger than before, so they could all share whatever time remained. Nikolai offered to stay and help, wanting to be near the father he never truly knew, and the mother figure who reminded him that love had been at the heart of all those secrets. Eliza and William spent hours sitting on the porch, their chairs close, hands entwined. Sometimes they would speak of the lost years, the regrets. Other times, they simply smiled at one another, amazed that they had been granted this final, precious chapter. William never tired of describing how often he thought of her beneath the magnolias, how he had carried her wedding ring across Europe, searching for a way back that never seemed safe enough. She forgave him for everything. In her mind, there was nothing to forgive, only gratitude that he had loved her so fiercely. On a bright morning, as the orchard shimmered with dew, William and Eliza strolled slowly through the trees, Nikolai at William's side for support, and Aaron pushing a small cart of tools, ready to tend to the blossoming branches. They paused at the spot where William and Eliza had shared their first dance as husband and wife. The grass was damp beneath their feet. The memory of that barefoot wedding was fresh in both their minds. William, stooped and trembling with age, held out the ring that had once been lost. He slipped it gently onto Eliza's finger again, the gold band catching the sunlight. She clasped his hand, tears of joy filling her eyes. In a quavering voice he said, "I'm finally back, my love, and we have our family here. Our orchard, our son, and the life I always wanted to give you." Eliza smiled, leaning in so their foreheads touched. "You kept your promise," she whispered. The orchard seemed to hum with life, bees droning among the blossoms, birds singing in the branches overhead. Aaron and Nikolai watched from a respectful distance, blinking back tears. In that instant, the hardships and separations, the secrets and the sorrows, all seemed to soften. They had arrived at a moment of reconciliation no one would have believed possible. In the months that followed, the four of them lived in a gentle rhythm. Each day, William's strength ebbed a little, but his spirit soared. Nikolai discovered a sense of belonging he had never felt in any other land. Eliza woke each morning to the comforting knowledge that the man she had loved so long ago was sitting at the table, sipping coffee, waiting for her. Aaron worked tirelessly, patching walls and replanting sections of the orchard. By late summer, the orchard was vibrant, fruit swelling on branches, and the farmhouse stood strong once again. On an afternoon heavy with the scent of ripe pears, William and Eliza renewed their vows, this time with Nikolai and Aaron bearing witness. They wore simple clothes, and the ceremony took place under the magnolia tree that had once canopied their first dance. William recited the same words from their original wedding, voice trembling but resolute, while Eliza held his hands, tears shining in her eyes. When they finished, the orchard filled with the sound of gentle applause, though only a handful of neighbors and friends were present. It felt perfect, intimate, loving, and final in a way that brought peace. Time moved on. Seasons shifted. In the depth of winter, the orchard fell quiet under a blanket of snow. William, fragile but content, spent much of his time reading by the window, Eliza at his side. Nikolai took to designing a new irrigation system for the orchard. Aaron planned a small farm stand for spring. They were building a future, one that interwove all their lives. One twilight, William beckoned Eliza outside. He led her, slowly, carefully, across the orchard, the snow crunching beneath their boots. He pointed to the sky, where the last streaks of sunset painted the clouds in brilliant orange. "That color always reminded me of your hair in the fading light," he said softly. Eliza laughed, the sound like a girl's giggle, and squeezed his hand. They stayed until the stars came out, letting the hush of the orchard cradle them. When spring returned, magnolia blossoms unfurled yet again, and William found himself feeling stronger, invigorated by a sense of completion he had never thought possible. That April, on the exact anniversary of the day he first left for war, William and Eliza decided to celebrate the orchard's revival. Neighbors, distant relatives, and a scattering of old friends gathered. Music drifted through the branches. Lanterns flickered as darkness fell. Nikolai watched, heart full, as William took Eliza in his arms, both of them unsteady but determined, and swayed gently to the music. It was a dance 79 years delayed, but just as sweet as the first time. Later that night, Aaron offered a toast. He recounted how a single hidden letter behind a rotted wall had brought them all to this moment. He thanked Eliza for never giving up hope, William for his courage, and Nikolai for embracing a history he could have ignored. The orchard glowed with laughter and candlelight. Eliza and William looked out at the faces gathered. Old friends, new family, neighbors who had pitched in to restore the orchard. Then their eyes met, and in that instant, neither could imagine a happier ending than the one unfolding beneath those blooming branches. They had lived separate lives beneath the weight of war and secrets, but they were together now, at long last, surrounded by the orchard that had witnessed their first vow and now witnessed a vow renewed. And so they continued, day by day, each breath a blessing they had once believed impossible. Love, they realized, needn't be measured by unbroken time or perfect circumstances. It could survive oceans, wars, decades of silence, and the harsh reality of hidden identities. In the end, it thrived in the people brought together by hope, by faith, and by one soldier's unbreakable promise. They chose to see each sunrise as a gift. Early each morning, William rose to find Eliza in the kitchen, the smell of tea filling the air. They'd exchange a tender kiss, content in the knowledge that for all the heartbreak and separation, they had come full circle. The orchard, too, seemed to flourish under the gentle care of Aaron and Nikolai, each tree heavy with blossoms that would soon become fruit. By the time Eliza's 100th birthday arrived, she stood beneath the magnolia canopy one more time, hands clasped with William's, Nikolai and Aaron at their sides. The orchard was alive with color and sound, birds chirping, neighbors chatting, and the wind carrying a sweet scent across the fields. William turned to her, eyes glistening, and said, "This is everything I ever wanted for us. It took a lifetime to get here, but I wouldn't trade one moment of it now." Eliza smiled, tears sparkling on her lashes. "You came back to me," she murmured. "That's all that matters." And so it was that William's heart never truly vanished. He had merely taken a detour through shadows and secrets, carrying love in his heart like a compass guiding him home. Eliza Monroe Hart, who had once waited by the window for footsteps that never came, now rested her head on his shoulder, content in the knowledge that their story had found its joyful conclusion. Their orchard stood as a testament to the power of enduring faith, the blossoming branches sheltering them in a renewed promise of life and love. Because sometimes letters arrive decades too late, sometimes families are found halfway across the world, and sometimes soldiers who vanish in one war finally return to dance in the orchard they left behind. And when they do, the only fitting ending is the one brimming with laughter, gratitude, and the gentle hush of magnolia petals drifting onto the grass, forever reminding them that love, once planted, can bloom again in the sweetest, most unexpected spring. Thanks for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please consider giving this video a like, and be sure to subscribe for more.